In Coloma, California, in 1858, gold was discovered by James W. Marshall at Sutter's Mine, and thus it led to the California Gold Rush and brought about 300,000 people from the world over. A year later, gold was discovered in Nevada, then called Western Utah Territory, by a party of Mormon immigrants who were making their way to California. The early travelers only lingered in Nevada until they crossed the Sierras. By 1858, prospectors were soon camping permanently in the area that is now Virginia City. A year later, gold was found in outcropping fields and hills and canyons. Among the gold, however, was silver, and was often ignored in favor of the former as it was not recognized in its form, but it will soon later prove to be valuable. This was the first of the silver from what came to be Comstock Lode. From Dayton to Brunswick, numerous mines and mills began to appear along the Carson River to process the ore from the Comstock Lode. Many of these mines were built with loans from the Bank of California. The Nevada agent William Sharon would foreclose upon the mines and mills when their owners defaulted on payments. The banks would gradually become the owners of many important mining and ore processing facilities. Because of the Comstock Lode, Virginia City grew with 25,000 inhabitants at its height and was amongst the wealthiest towns of the West. But many mines were closed due to the cost of transportation, leaving the high-quality ore mines worth processing to stay open. William Sharon, being in control of the mines and ore facilities, along with business associates Darius Ogden Mills and William Ralston, realized that cheaper form of transportation between the mines, mills, and the cities would allow the bank holdings to be more profitable. Many propositions of a railroad servicing the area and decrease the cost began as early as 1861. William Sharon's vision for the railroad was to run from Virginia City through Gold Hill, where the first of the Comstock Lode was mined, passing the mills along the river, ending at the state capital of Nevada, Carson City. The route, when finished, would cover 21 miles, 33.7 kilometers, descend 1,575 feet of elevation, and have so many curves as to make 17 full circles in the 13.5 miles, 21.7 kilometers from the river to Virginia City. Ground was broken below Gold Hill on February 18, 1869 on American Flats when grading crews went to work. 7 tunnels were made on the line, and had taken 2 to 5 months each to make each hole through, and an 85 feet tall by 500 feet long trestle bridge to go over Crown Point Ravine. The first ceremonial spike was placed on September 28, 1869 by Superintendent H.M. Yerington, and the first passenger train to Carson City pulled in on January 28, 1870. 5 steam locomotives have served the railroad and were named after Nevada counties. Number 1 Lion, Number 2 Ormsby, Number 3 Story, Number 4 Virginia, and Number 5 Carson. The first 3, Lion, Ormsby, and Story, were built by H.J. Booth Union Iron Works in San Francisco, and the last 2, Virginia and Carson, were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, all of them having the distinction of them being the first steam locomotives in Virginia City. Lion, having the distinction of being the first engine for the V&T, also pulled the works train to Virginia City the day before the first passenger train, on January 27, 1870. It also pulled the first ore train from the Yellow Jacket mine on November 18, 1869. Ormsby pulled the first car revenue for the company, which was a load of lumber for the Crown Point Company. It was also the first engine to cross the trestle bridge at Crown Point Ravine on November 12, 1869. By December 21st that year, regular scheduled trains were running between Gold Hill and Carson City, hauling wood and lumber up the hill and ore back down to the mines. It ran 30 to 45 trains per day during the height of the Big Bonanza from Carson City, Virginia City, and Gold Hill. It made an expansion to Reno in 1872 to connect to the Central Pacific Railroad, which would allow through trains between Virginia City to San Francisco. The first Virginia City to Reno train was hauled by the railroad's number 11 locomotive, Reno, appropriate for the occasion, and this milestone marked the completion of the V&T. By 1875, the railroad was earning a profit of $100,000 per month, which is well over $2 billion by today's money. By 1924, the railroad's decline had started when it hadn't made a profit that year. Mining revenue had dropped off to very low levels, with the exception of the Minden Line, whose revenue was still flowing. Passenger numbers had seen a downfall due to the increased use of automobiles on the various highways that run alongside the V&T. Darius Ogden Mills' grandson, Ogden Livingston Mills, was the sole owner of the railroad around 1933, and had personally paid the deficits in the operating costs of the railroad as a nod to his family's history during the early days of Virginia City. Sadly, he died of heart disease in October 1937, and a year later the railroad was in receivership and management had planned to cease operations. At that time, the line had 3 locomotives, which were the second number 25, along with number 26 and 27. The reason why there were 2 engines bearing the number 25 is because the first one, being an ex-Union Pacific locomotive, wasn't living up to expectations. The second number 25 was the V&T's first new purchased locomotive since 1876, and was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1905, as well as number 26 built in 1907, and 27 built in 1913. Services between Nevada and Carson City were ceased the same year, with the last train being hauled by number 27 and number 11 Reno, but interest in the line and equipment from the likes of rail fans and Hollywood kept the line running. But it wasn't enough. The last train on the V&T ran on May 31, 1950, and was hauled by the railroad's number 27. Originally, it was to be hauled by the railroad's number 26 on May 1st, but its shed was caught on fire in Reno and was deemed as a total loss and was therefore scrapped. Many experts think that number 27 pulling the final train was rather fitting, as it was the last new locomotive purchased by the railroad. One of the passengers on the last train of the V&T in 1938 was named Robert C. Gray, who was a rail enthusiast from Virginia City. In 1972, he had a plan to rebuild the V&T as a tourist railroad, and after gaining approval from Story County, reconstruction started in 1974 from F Street to the eastern portal of Tunnel 4. Trains started to run on the line on July 2, 1976, just in time for America's bicentennial. Work to reopen Tunnel 4 was done in the late 1980s. After that, work started on Tunnel 3, but a large boulder shifted and blocked the tunnel, resulting the railroad to build a shoehorn around the tunnel. By 1991, the line reached Gold Hill, and by 2009, the line reached Carson City, led by the Nevada Commission for the Reconstruction of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad since September 2005. The V&T is a popular destination for tourists, offering steam train rides on weekends and diesel train rides on weekdays, along with special event days. We visited the railroad on Tuesday, June 13, 2023, where they're running their diesel locomotive D1 as far as Gold Hill. But before we see the locomotive, we see number 11 Reno on display at the main station in Virginia City. Reno had quite the illustrious history. It was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works for the Virginia and Truckee in 1872 as a wood-burning locomotive, and pulled the first train to Reno that same year, as mentioned earlier. By 1876 it was converted to burn coal, and by 1907 it was converted to oil burning, and it then retired in July 1937 and began to partake in films. Its first role was in the 1937 film Courage of the West by Universal Pictures, starring Bob Baker and Lois January. A year later, the locomotive was leased to Paramount Pictures, and would be later sold to Lowe's Incorporated, later MGM Studios in 1945. Ever since then, it had appeared in many of MGM's films, as well as films outside of the company, such as LePert and United Artists, and in a couple of TV commercials as well as various TV shows, including Rawhide starring Clint Eastwood. In 1969 it was renumbered 199 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. A year later it was sold to the old Tucson Studios in Arizona, and had appeared in other various movies for the big and small screens for such companies like CBS, ABC, 20th Century Fox, NBC, Columbia Pictures, and HBO, as well as other commercials for businesses such as First National Bank of Seattle and Panasonic. Some of the movies it starred in had big names, such as Johnny Cash, Kirk Douglas, and Kenny Rogers. In 1988, Reno had even travelled overseas to Switzerland to be on display at the Swiss Museum of Transport in Lucerne, and later returned to Old Tucson that year. Sadly, in 1995, the Old Tucson studio was caught fire, and Reno was a victim of it, but the only casualty it suffered was the loss of the cab and wooden floorboards. But it was cosmetically restored in 1997 for its role in the 1999 Warner Bros. Film Wild Wild West, which was a loose adaptation of the 1960s TV show bearing the same name, which the locomotive had also starred in. The 1999 film had names such as Will Smith, Kevin Kline, and Kenneth Branagh. Its most recent screen role was in 2015 for the show Legends and Lies by Warm Springs Productions. The locomotive was in a total number of 77 productions. It had even carried other famous passengers before traversing to the film world, such as the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, and 26th President Theodore Roosevelt. In 2020, Old Tucson was closed down with its future in limbo due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the V&T acquired the locomotive in 2021 and returned to the railroad 2 days later for the first time since it was withdrawn from service in 1937. Meanwhile, Old Tucson's future was given a second chance, with American Heritage Railways taking over the business selected by Pima County in Arizona. The doors to the park were reopened on October 6, 2022. There are plans by the railroad to restore Reno to its former glory for a second movie career, as well as creating a shed for the locomotive to avoid being exposed to the natural elements. For more information, visit their website, seethereno.com. Link is in the description box below. Back to the railroad. And while we had seen some historical rolling stock such as these cabooses that ran on lines such as the Chicago, Bellington and Quincy and the Southern Pacific, D1 had arrived at the main station with its first passengers. D1 was built by General Electric in 1953 for the United States Marines as a shunting engine, or switch engines as they are called in the US. It came to the railroad in 2003 and was once fitted with a Nathan K3LA horn, but was later replaced with a Hancock air whistle, which sounds similar to a steam locomotive's whistle. As we climb aboard the train, let's take a look at the wonderful mountainous scenery in Nevada as we make the trip to Gold Hill.
Welcome into these open ore cars of the V&T. Two superintendents working right there were John Mackey and James Fair. They went uptown and they very quietly began purchasing old abandoned mines all around the Consolidated Virginia mine. And that's where 30 days later they would discover, right down about the 1,200 foot level, what everybody would start calling the Big Bonanza. They found a ledge of silver ore that was 40 feet thick. 75 cents would buy them a complete steak dinner, probably more than they could even lift, and they would get dessert. 25 cents got them an entire gallon of Old Tub whiskey. That was part of the original Jim Beam brand. And a dime would get them a fresh, hot bath once a week. Another thing a dime would get them to our second tunnel. This is actually our first real tunnel. This is tunnel number 4. That's not confusing, right? Look at the walls of this tunnel as we go through it. Tunnel 4 is 417 feet long, and it is all dug by hand. They had no explosives, they just had picks and shovels. And yet they completed it in what everybody said was record time, because somehow they could average 18 inches a day. This is not our longest tunnel by any means. Tunnel number 2 in American Flat is 1,000 feet long. Once we clear the tunnel, right here, right alongside us, you're going to see a dirt road. That is part of the original wagon toll road up to Virginia City. That's how all the stagecoaches, freight wagons would get up and down the mountain. In a minute, we're going to go around. But this little chute line does allow us to be one of the finest of the Old West and the longest in continuous operation in the state of Nevada. They actually opened before Nevada was Nevada. The last building, the one with the red brick facing, is where the Bank of California was. Wish you could have seen that vault. Within 3 months of completing this railroad, the boys from the bank enjoyed a profit of $400,000 every single month. Today's money, that would be a mere $78 million. That is a profit. While those miners were desperately digging for all of that gold, they kept working through that thick blue muck. It was a mess. It got all over everything. It stuck to their clothing. It destroyed their little cradle rockers and their sluice boxes. They kept just shoveling it off to the side. And then they realized that as it dried out, it became almost as solid as concrete. So they started taking it back uptown at night. They patched potholes in the streets. Then one day, some much more experienced Mexican miners came through here, and they looked at that blue muck that was being thrown away. They probably looked at each other pretty. Right now, in the east, we're going to feel a little wrinkle here. Right there. That little shimmy is a result of an earthquake we had last August. One little tiny kink in one rail right there at that bottom. This Gold Hill Depot was sold years ago to Story County for $1 right after the BNC began to sell out all their equipment. Originally it was built with not one single nail. All very tight joinery. Modus Tenant construction. It's a very popular place for all kinds of things. Office parties, big dinners. Christmas, we have a group of 200 rail fans coming up. I think they're going to have their dinner for Tunnel 3. This is the other end of that collapsed Tunnel 3 that we saw right now. No self-respecting diesel locomotive would leave that kind of a mess in such a tunnel. The diesel that we're using right now are deep. Now in a minute, we're going to go back through Tunnel 4. Now it's usually a walk in the park when the diesel is pulling us, because it's not hot at all and it's not smoke. Which you can't possibly see is where the famous Occidental mine is located, and it had, without a doubt, the highest quality or purest grade of ore of all of these Comstock mines. My favorite mine is right up at the end of this little ravine. Hear what your religious beliefs are. If you need more incentive than that, here you go. They sell wine in the basement. Yep. I've never tasted it, but people say it's not bad wine. I don't think you have to be a good Catholic theology anyway.
If you'd like to visit the Virginia and Truckee, then please visit their website. Link is in the description box below.